Everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Darko Ages. We're back again to talk about the NBA and a team that's a little more recent than some of the others that we've done. We're going to talk about the 2003, 2004, 2005 Indiana Pacers, a team that we remember as being a major rival of the Going to Work Pistons that we have some really fond memories about. So we're looking forward to jumping into them. They're a really interesting team that, had a lot of success, but never really got across the finish line for a variety of reasons. The biggest one everybody has heard about. So we'll get into all of that, but we'll start, Zach, what's happening? How's your Thursday going?
Yeah, Thursday's good. It's April 3rd. It's in the feast today. It's going to snow apparently again on Monday, which will be pretty brutal. Outside of that, though, just enjoying seeing grass. The Masters is soon, so, positive all around.
Yeah, it's peak.
Wow. Positive all around from Zach.
Positive
That's pretty good. I'm going to throw some negativity into it for you. You've had 3.5 days. Are you... You're finally over the Michigan State loss?
No, I think it was a silly loss. They should have won the game. There's no question about it. The guy had a lover/loser tattoo behind his ear. Like, how are you gonna lose to a guy like that? But at the end of the day, when you throw the most money and build the most expensive roster in the tournament, you're probably gonna win some games.
Yeah.
Did you just not tweet negatively about their chances early enough in the game, or that's usually your jinx?
Yeah, do you blame in other words, do you blame yourself for the loss?
I do. I am the golden god when it comes to Michigan State sports, and I don't know that I even did it all for this game, which was pretty brutal. It was
there you go.
Happened so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that 18-0 run just set the stage in such a way that Zach felt like even the reverse jinx wasn't going to be enough to bring us back. In the interim, half our team is in the portal. So I guess we could do like an entire pod on NIL and the transfer portal. That would be even more depressing.
Yeah, right.
I think instead, one, I got to shout out a couple of our favorite listeners, my nephew Patrick, my niece Lizzie, apparently devoted listeners in the car with their dad. Told them we'd give them some content. So I got to ask you guys off the cuff, no prep. This one's for Patrick. You guys got like a favorite dinosaur? I've always been a fan of the Stegosaurus, but
I can see you being a Stegosaurus guy. Love a good T-Rex. Who doesn't love a T-Rex? But the more I think about it, I think the pterodactyl is kind of the GOAT. Like, what a strange beast that is. That's probably still flying around. Like, vultures are basically pterodactyls,
Yeah, T-Rex. I mean,
you're just going T-Rex.
Yeah,
all right, that's fair. Why mess with the long time GOAT dinosaur? It's the first one everybody thinks about. All right, well, let's jump into the 2003-2004 Pacers. They were the number one seed going into the playoffs. Well, actually, let's pause for a second. What were you guys doing in 2004? We were all in college. This is the first time that we weren't actually at the same schools. We were like kind of doing the same things, just in different locations. Any other memories about 2004? It was a bad year for Michigan State football. I know that for sure.
I was learning how to drink. I remember that. Sophomore at Michigan. So that's probably my big takeaway.
Yeah, I was likely either just enrolled or just transferred into state. I did some bouncing around in my college years. Don't have a ton of memories. That's probably why I was doing some bouncing around. But, do remember just in general that era for sports, for Detroit sports, I should say. The Red Wings were really good then, too.
Yeah, this was the height of my Pistons fandom. I will say that. I mean, they were talking about a team that built up and was so fun to root for. So I loved the NBA in general. I watched a ton of nationally televised games, watched basically every Pistons game. So I guess that's what you can do when you're drinking beers at night when you're supposed to be studying in college. Fire up all the games. So watched a lot of college sports and a lot of pro sports too.
Yeah, you just never have to go to bed. It's like West Coast game starts at 10:15. Do not care. I'm up watching it anyway. So thanks for getting us into basketball. In spring of 2004, like I said, we're gonna kind of cross a couple seasons. Maybe that's cheating a little bit, but it's our pod, so we can do what we want. But 2004, the Indiana Pacers, as I noted at the top, are the 1 seed in the Eastern Conference. They finished 61-21. A really good team. A team that, obviously, as I said, they were the 1 seed. They were third in net rating that year. A really good defensive team. featuring the Defensive Player of the Year, actually, Ron Artest, now known as Metta World Peace or Metta Sanford Artest or something. He's changed his names a few times since 2004. Also had Jermaine O'Neal, Al Harrington, Reggie Miller, Jeff Foster, Anthony Johnson, Jamal Tinsley, the point guard. So a really good team. Like I said, the team that really going into probably up until February of 2004 probably was the favorite to win the Eastern Conference. I say that February date because February is when the Pistons traded for Rasheed Wallace, and I think that really changed the landscape for the Eastern Conference going into the playoffs. So what do you guys remember about the 2004 Pacers and, like how they matched up with the Pistons going into that playoff series?
Yeah, they were tough. Played great defense, and they were young. Reggie Miller and I think maybe Dale Davis or somebody was on this team. But they otherwise had a bunch of up-and-coming guys just entering their primes. Ron Artest was developing into a two-way superstar, and I think people kind of forget about just how good he was because of, the fallout and how the rest of his career played out. Jermaine O'Neal is an interesting character. He toiled in Portland and was all promise, who everybody said, maybe he'll be good someday. He went to Indiana and was just immediately good. I remember that specifically because I'm pretty sure I got him as a late round draft pick or even a free agent pickup in fantasy basketball, and then he exploded and became like a great player for my team. They had Jamal Tinsley, who would have crazy assist games where he'd have like 8 points and 17 assists. Probably also remember that from fantasy basketball. And then they had another guy who was super young, who came in as super athletic, and I don't want him to be forgotten, Jonathan Bender. Our mutual friend Reese never lets me forget that guy because when we're playing golf and I'm standing over a 4-foot putt or a 3-foot putt that has some break in it, he'll say, "Ooh, little Jonathan here," to refer to a putt that's a bender. So I always remember Jonathan Bender basically from golfing, which is kind of a funny anecdote.
Yeah, this Pacers team was obviously really good, 61-21. Just to jump on Jermaine O'Neal a little bit there too, Pat. All-NBA second team, third at MVP voting that year as well. He dominated, and he was a great fantasy basketball player too. He occupied the forward center spot, which is always super valuable in fantasy basketball. They had Reggie Miller, of course, end of the career. He's late 30s at that point. He became the Pacers' all-time leading scorer that season. And, of course, Rick Carlisle, the head coach, was Coach of the Year runner-up. I'll give you guys each $5 if you can guess who won Coach of the Year that year. Yep, you're not going to get it. Hubie Brown, Coach of the Year winner that year.
Wow.
Rick Carlisle was the runner-up, despite coaching the Pacers to the best record in the East at 61.
Yeah, so let's I guess just get to the meat of this here. The Pacers they get to the playoffs. They're the 1 seed. They sweep the Celtics. We're never sad to see that in the first round. They beat the Heat in 6 in the second round, and then they get to the Eastern Conference Finals against our Pistons, and that's a series that obviously sticks out in our minds. The Pistons win in 6, a series that, I don't know, I was looking back through the stats, so I mean, obviously it felt really close in the moment. Some of the games, if you just look at the box score, didn't look super close at the end, but I do really feel like, the Pistons, obviously, we're biased here, but the Pistons at that stage were the better team, but I don't feel like it was a dominant win by any means. So I'm going to start with a question. I mean, obviously, the famous play from that series is Tayshaun's chase down block on Reggie Miller. Do you guys know what game that actually happened in without looking it up?
Yeah, I got it. It's 2.
Yeah, that's right. So in my head, before I looked, I was thinking that it was like game 5 and it sort of won the series in some ways for the Pistons, which obviously in game 2, it's not quite the same, but I do, the Pacers won that game 1, and had they won game 2, obviously the Pistons were coming back home for the next 2 games. So, they're definitely not out of it, but I do think the series becomes much riskier for the Pistons if they're down 0-2 coming back after that game. I just remember 2 teams that were in some ways mirror images of each other and just played super hard, physical, defense first. Like every possession felt like an absolute slog. It was like one of those series where if you missed and they got a make, it felt like just a huge swing because these games were being decided in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. What else, Pat, do you remember about that series?
Yeah, I think you made a really good point about the teams being mirror images, both built on an identity of defense first. Ben Wallace anchoring the Pistons, Artest anchoring the Pacers. I've never heard Rip Hamilton say that he modeled his game after Reggie Miller, but if you were going to say who did Rip Hamilton play like from the generation before him, I think it's pretty clearly Reggie Miller. It's interesting, too, because you don't see a lot of offense in the NBA run this way, where a point guard's dribbling up top and there's a lot of off-ball screen action where guys are coming around, hunting shots. One of the teams that's doing that right now is actually the Pistons with Malik Beasley, who I kind of was thinking is a current. His season this year is kind of the way they use him is similar to how Reggie was used. Reggie was not a guy who would regularly beat players off the dribble, but he was really good with his pump fake, get a little separation. He was really good at drawing fouls, I think kind of in a way that was annoying. He talked a ton of trash, so he was also annoying for that aspect. And interestingly with him, this was like a swan song, right? He had a long career, had playoff appearances with, Mark Jackson and Rick Smits and these older Pacers teams. And he was the one holdover that was still around for this younger version, kind of the leader. And when thinking about this team, I think it's interesting to discuss Reggie's place, like his legacy. There are other stars I can think of that at the end of their career, successful careers, they finally get over the hump and win a title. And that's kind of the cements their legacy. And Reggie never got that, partly because that Tayshaun Prince block in the playoff series, and then partly because of the malice that we're obviously going to discuss coming up. Yeah, a fascinating team, a team I think that could have won a title if the Pistons hadn't been able to make the trade for Rasheed Wallace. That the record shows that they were a better regular season team than Detroit that year. I remember my feeling in the playoffs was I was on edge the entire series thinking it could swing either way. So like you said, every make felt huge. Every miss felt big. Yeah, and the era was just defense. It was really hard to score. I know a lot of the modern talk on the NBA is how this era was kind of trash and the players are just so much more skilled. But I do think there was more physicality and even just a greater focus on defense that isn't around today in the NBA. Maybe starting to come back a little bit, but these teams would mug you and make it really difficult to play. And the Pacers were one of those teams.
Yeah, definitely. And to piggyback on that a bit there, Pat, these teams had skill, obviously. I mean, look at the rosters. They have all NBA players. They have some all-time greats. But, yeah, the defense was sort of the star of the times where you could be more physical. The Pacers that year were the number one rated defense in points per game. It wasn't just Ron Artest who was the defensive player of the year. Steven Jackson, Jeff Foster were all great defenders as well. And, yeah, you hit the nail on the head where it was like at any point, the series could swing either way depending on, two baskets, basically. That's so stressful, but it was fun.
Yeah, just to illustrate for the listeners, the Pistons won in 6 games. In no game did they score more than 85 points. So they win 4 games without scoring more than 85 points. The Pacers win game 1, 78-74. The Pistons win game 2, 72-67 in the game that, again, Tayshaun won the game with that block to save it. So, the Pacers presumably get to 70 without that play, and they win the game with 70 points. And game 3 is a relative high-scoring explosion of 85-78. The Pacers win game 4, 83-68. Pistons win game 5, 83-65. And then the Pistons win game 6 to go to the NBA Finals 69-65, which is just wild. Nice. And Yeah, I mean, to Pat's point, obviously the game has changed. We talked a little bit about this on the other Pistons pod we did, that the shooting is different, but I do really think some of this is league rules too, right? So it's not just that these teams, nobody plays defense anymore. Like, the league has made it much harder to play defense. And I do think that there is like a certain excitement in the way the game is played today. But I can just, as a fan, I just distinctly remember the tension of these games and just the feeling that every possession was so significant. I mean, it sort of almost felt like playoff baseball, where you're sort of every at bat feels like it can swing it because every bucket is so meaningful. And, I'm not saying, I don't know that I would want to go back to it, but I do think maybe we remember it fondly because the Pistons in 2004, 2005 were the epitome of that. And it was obviously to their benefit, the way the game was called then. And, it's always fun to root for your team to win. So I suppose if you were just a random Celtics fan and you were struggling to score 65 points against the Pistons in the regular season, you're just like, my God, why do I have to watch this? But as a fan of one of the teams, the signature teams from that era, it was fun to watch, in my opinion. And that's true of the Pacers too.
Yeah, you bring up playoff baseball, and I think it's true, obviously, for NHL sudden death game in the playoffs, where like every time down the ice when you're on defense, your heart is in your chest that you're going to lose the game. I think that fans can feel the intensity from the players too. Like, that's not just our perception, but like the players treated every possession like was the game was on the line. And I think that is missing a little bit from the modern NBA. It picks up in the playoffs, but I mean, even this year's playoffs, when they start, I think those scores you just mentioned the final score that won the game would probably lose a series in 3 quarters.
Right.
Of the scores of the playoffs this year. Some teams are usually over 80 after 3.
Oh yeah.
It's definitely rule changes. I do think you're right though. The importance of the possession was treated so greatly that you could feel the intensity, that guys were giving everything they could to get a stop. I think there's now some resignation. Nikola Jokic goes for a 60-point triple-double, and he's just nobody can stop him. Right. He's too good.
Right.
There's nothing we can do. I don't remember ever thinking that in this era. It was like, we can stop everybody.
Yeah.
Nobody can score.
Right.
It was kind of the exact opposite.
Well, I mean, that's a good segue to, going into the final. So obviously we're Pistons fans. And so the national media was very much picking the Lakers, right? The Shaq Kobe Lakers are this unstoppable force. Obviously they're great players. I remember, we're biased as Pistons fans, but I just remember thinking like, we are going to be in this series because nobody can score on us. So I guess we're not here to talk about the Pistons, sadly, although we're going to do a lot of it anyway. So I guess my question, I'll start with Zach. So if the Pistons don't make that Rasheed Wallace trade and the Pacers go to the NBA Finals, do they beat that Lakers team, do you think?
That's a great question, Kenny. My thought would be who best matches up with Shaq, or do they have the sort of wherewithal to let Kobe just cook and then just shut everyone else out, which is what, if my memory serves me, that was the Pistons' strategy. It was Kobe can score all day, no one else is scoring a single bucket. It would be a really fun series, especially how old those Lakers were and how young the Pacers were. I think the Pacers probably would have won, or it's going 7,
They had the defensive player of the year to put on Kobe. So if anybody's going to bother Kobe, it would have been Ron Artest.
Especially that era Ron Artest.
Yeah, I think it's easy to say in hindsight. I think I would lean towards the Pacers. I think they are just as well equipped as the Pistons were to deal with Kobe on the perimeter with Ron Artest, Al Harrington, Jamal Tinsley sort of guarding the point of attack. Their perimeter defense, I think, was just as good as the Pistons. And Jermaine O'Neal was a great defender, too. I think what the Pistons had after the Rasheed trade was that combination of Ben and Rasheed. And I don't know that the Pacers had that second big. I think Jermaine O'Neal would have made Shaq work, but, he gets in foul trouble. They don't have somebody to sort of take some of that responsibility away from him. That might have been the only difference in terms of the matchup. But I just think the depth, I think the same things that were true of the Pistons were true of that Pacers team. They were younger, they were hungrier, they were more connected as a team than that '04 Lakers team, which, you know, when you get to hindsight, it's like, okay, Karl Malone's on his last legs. Shaq and Kobe apparently can barely stand each other, and they got hit in the mouth repeatedly by the Pistons and just didn't have an answer. I mean, honestly, that even with the Pistons with Rashid, that Pacer series was closer than the Lakers series for the Pistons. They gave them a more difficult series than the Lakers did. So I'd be inclined to say I think the Pacers get it done in that series.
I'd pick the Pacers too. I think you're exactly right. They were a tougher matchup for Detroit, and they were a team that would have mucked it up in the same way the Pistons did against the Lakers. It is a fascinating what if to think about the history of the NBA. Like, does Shaq get traded if they win, if the Lakers win that series? The Pacers then would have been crowned champs. They would have had Reggie go out with this crowning achievement. They would have had started their Eastern Conference kind of dynasty that they're probably trying to build. At this time, they had a young team. They had, I think, Ron Artest was 25, 26. They had Al Harrington and then traded him for Steven Jackson, 26. Jamal Tinsley, 26. So they weren't going anywhere if they, if the history had played out differently. They won the title and didn't have the malice at the palace the following season. So I think in the history of the NBA, things would have changed very, very radically had the Pacers won the series. And maybe it turns on that Tayshaun. That's how it felt. So if Tayshaun Prince doesn't chase down Reggie Miller, make that block at the rim, modern fans, younger people than us probably can recall some LeBron James chase down blocks. But that Tayshaun Prince block was before any of those LeBron blocks, and was, just like we said, possessions were so important. So it felt like a game, like the game completely changed on that one play. The Pistons were going to lose, and Tayshaun Prince resurrected the game. They won the game and won the series.
Yeah, agreed. And like I said at the outset, we're going to kind of cheat a little and talk about two different years because it's kind of hard to separate this era of Pacers basketball. But just to kind of give the listeners a little context. So in 2002, 2003, the Pacers were 48-34. So a pretty good team, playoff team. Their coach is Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah famously got into trouble later with the Knicks for a whole variety of things. But for whatever reason, they go from Isaiah to Rick Carlisle, bring back a lot of the core of that team, and then they go 61-21. And they lose in the series that we just spent a lot of time talking about. So that kind of brings us into the next season, 04-05, in which they, again, bring back almost the same core. Pat touched on it. Al Harrington in 2004 was sort of their sixth man. In the offseason, he demands a trade. He wants a bigger role. So they trade him to Atlanta for Steven Jackson. But aside from that, it's essentially the same team that they're bringing back. And, I think the expectation is it will be the Pacers and the Pistons battling for the East again this year, which brings us to November and the Test Melee, Malice at the Palace, depending on what you want to call it. Lots of people have talked about that event ad nauseum. I mean, there's been no shortage of takes of that over the years. So I don't know that we need to rehash like everything that happened that night. But I am just going to start by saying, for me, this is one of those events where I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing. Pat, what about you? Do you know what you were doing or where you were at watching that game?
Yep, 100%. It was a nationally televised game. I was sitting on my couch in Ann Arbor, in my apartment, watching the game, fired up about the two top teams in the Eastern Conference facing off, our defending champion Pistons against their biggest rival at the time, the Pacers, and it didn't go well. The Pacers outplayed the Pistons, and Reggie's talking his talk, and Artest was the best player on the court, and famously lays down on the scorer's table to taunt the Pistons and the crowd. Gets a beverage thrown on him, and the malice begins. I was fired up. Like, I remember the energy that gave me. I went from my couch to standing 3 feet from the TV watching it. And obviously I'm a biased Pistons fan, so I probably was prone to believing that this is Artest's fault for provoking this. But as the coverage ended of the brawl and went back to the ESPN show, John Saunders basically like just tore into the Pistons fans, the city of Detroit. Like, man went at us hard, and I was enraged. I couldn't believe what he was saying. So I remember just how angry I was. How about you, Zach?
Yeah, do remember where I was. I was visiting my girlfriend at Michigan State at the time, as a matter of fact, looking through some history there.
You want to elaborate on?
No, the Artest melee was really something else. You know, he was averaging over 24 points a game at that point. It was early in the season, obviously. The Pacers were among the top 5 favorites to win the championship that year. They were like 6-1 based on sports books at the time. So it was really sort of a moment in time for their season and franchise for this to happen, for Artest to just lay on the scorer's table and that fan to throw a drink at him, and, you know, just a series of silly things to make that happen, to just throw your whole season and the whole franchise into a tailspin.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys read it. It had been a long time, but there was a really great oral history of the event that Grantland did that was all sort of first-person interviews. And, I mean, it was, I think at the time, 10 years later, and obviously people are going to remember it in a way that is, you know, somewhat favorable to them. But it was interesting to hear people talk about it. And, you know, it's kind of interesting because there's all this talk about, I don't know, you guys remember like coming out of COVID, there was all this talk about how fan behavior had like gotten so much worse. And it's like, well, I mean, people have been, sadly, not to justify it, but like people have been throwing drinks and things at players off and on for years. I mean, there's like plenty of examples in the 80s of things like that happening. I do think, again, I said we weren't going to go through the whole thing, but it's just sort of like too hard not to. But one of the points that somebody made in that oral history is that the fact that he was on the scorer's table did 2 things. It both enraged the fans, but it also removed that barrier. So he was already partway into the crowd, which is, like, again, one of those like weird, if he's just standing on the court and somebody throws something at him, it's much easier for security to like hold him back before he can charge up there. But because he's on the scoring table, it's just like he snaps and he goes into the crowd and all hell breaks loose. And again, we don't have to go too far into that, but metaphorically, all hell breaks loose for the league and particularly for the Pacers, right? Because the aftermath is he gets suspended for the entire season, he being Ron Artest. Steven Jackson gets suspended for 40 or 50 games. Jermaine O'Neal initially gets suspended for 40 games. His suspension ends up getting cut down because I think they realized like he never actually left the court. He famously decked some Pistons fan that ran out there, which, you know, I mean, I'd be inclined to defend a Pistons fan, but if you're gonna be on the court charging after professional athletes, like, you better be prepared for some consequences to happen, right?
Yeah.
Taking on the 6'10" Jermaine O'Neal, not a thing that I would be inclined to do. But, you know, I have a lot of the same memories as Pat, where I was watching it in Cedar Village, in our friends Brian and Murph's apartment, and yeah, it was like we're sitting around drinking beer, ready for whatever else is going to happen that night. I'm sure we were planning to go to a party, or we were going to have a party at the place. And then the game in the fourth quarter is not close. And then all of a sudden we're watching and we're all just standing and screaming at the TV, like, what is going on? And then you could tell, like, looking around Cedar Village, we're out on all these balconies. You could tell that half of the apartments, everybody else is watching the game too. And people are going crazy. Like, what is happening right now? So it's just one of those moments that as a Detroit sports fan, it's weird because, you know, like a lot of the other things that where if I say I remember exactly where I was, it's like when the Red Wings won a title or something like that. It's not this regular season event that, but, you know, it's really like completely unprecedented. You know, we talked about the fallout. Well, like I said, the Pacers going into that season were, as Zach noted, kind of the favorites or co-favorites maybe in the East, and one of the title favorites. So they end up finishing 44-38, another, you know, a good record, but not anything that special for what their expectations were. They never get Ron Artest back. I think Jermaine O'Neal ended up getting hurt after he came back, so their team is just kind of not quite the same, but they lose in this case in the second round to the Pistons. And weirdly, I don't really remember much about that series. I don't know, maybe frankly, because even though it went 6, if you look through the kind of game log, it doesn't seem like the games were particularly close, the games the Pistons won. And I guess I don't really ever remember feeling like that series was in doubt for the Pistons, because the Pacers were just so decimated by suspension and injury that it just didn't really feel like they were going to compete. And maybe that can kind of get into the way that team was built. We talked a lot about Ron Artest already, but when you take him out, he's like kind of the centerpiece of the defense, and they're just not the same team. So, the team post Melee is just not a contender, which I think made them why they were interesting for this podcast, because they have this elite season in 2004 when they're 61-21. They look like they're going to be a contender, as Pat said, for the next 3, 4, 5 years. And then this one event just sort of ends their window of contention for, really, they aren't good again until the next decade.
Yeah. And I think what's super fascinating to me about this situation and the malice, is that you can talk about how it abruptly ended this iteration of the Pacers being a contender in the NBA. But we talked earlier about the intensity of games during this era and the intensity and physicality of defense during this era. And you had games where it felt like a fight. It felt like mano a mano. It felt like guys really, truly cared and were battling. And then that physicality, that intensity, we felt it as fans, and that erupted and culminated in the malice. The two most physical teams in the league that now have a rivalry, that are the two best teams in the Eastern Conference, that are both trying to beat each other through physicality and toughness. And then it went too far, and I don't know, I haven't heard anyone from the league ever talk about this, but we talk about the rule changes and the scoring difference between that era and this era. And I don't know how much of the genesis, like the reason that the league wanted to change, was based on the watchability, the ratings, or how much of this incident made the league office think this is too much. We don't want to, have fights. And so we need to scale back the physical nature of basketball in the NBA to pull this back. And, I think that you can really look at that as a catalyst point of the rule changes, of a different style of basketball, of celebrating skill and shooting over toughness and defense. It's just like an end of an era. I think it's a fascinating team to talk about in that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some quick thoughts on that, there's no doubt about it that they were connected, that the NBA wanted to showcase these players' athleticism versus their physicality. This is tinfoil hat type stuff, but there's no doubt they put out, memos to media that they had to talk more poorly about the Pistons of this era because of this. They wanted, it's a championship that happened, but they don't really want to consider it a good championship.
Yeah, I know we feel that because, there is this sense that this era of basketball, as we kind of talked about earlier, is like the black sheep era of the NBA, the late 90s, early 2000s, when the league sucks and all the players are bad. And I think that's just an oversimplification. But to Zach's point about just the image, it's the season after that David Stern institutes the dress code policy, right? He's trying to clean up the image of the league. So I think all that stuff is definitely connected to the rule changes. And in some ways, as it should be, right? Obviously, like, the malice could have been way worse, right? Like, nobody was seriously injured that I recall. And so, but the league is like, this can never happen again. And we talked a little bit about, aside from the fight, there were a lot of people complaining just about how slow the games were and how they weren't. So I think it's all of that. It's not like one thing that led to the rule changes, but I do think it's definitely tied to it.
if you think about it as a pendulum, and like that era was the farthest the pendulum had swung in the direction of physicality, defense, like bruteness winning, and then it's been swinging in the opposite direction. Do you think we're starting to see some pullback on the softness of the NBA? So I want to talk about this because obviously we're Pistons fans, and just in the last week we had the mayhem in Minneapolis where the very physical upstart Pistons got into a brawl with the very physical, somewhat upstart Timberwolves. Now, these aren't conference rivals, which, by the way, I think that if we have NBA expansion, I would love to see Minnesota move over. I mean, it just makes sense. Like in other sports, Minnesota is typically, I mean, I think of the Vikings, so we just did their pod. But we saw this brawl, and guys got suspended. There were 7 ejections or whatever, and the first kind of fight like this in a while, and I found it telling that it's 2 teams known for their physicality and defense and a lot of shit talking as well. You have Malik Beasley doing his shimmy in front of the Timberwolves bench. You have Anthony Edwards, who's known as just one of the biggest trash talkers in the NBA, who talks to everybody all the time. You have Gobert, who's known for his physicality. You have a lot of, I mean, Isaiah Stewart obviously has a reputation. Ron Holland won't back down to anybody. You have these personalities that kind of had some similarities back then to the Pacers squad. And I wonder if we're seeing teams that make their identity defense have some success, and the NBA kind of following that model to kind of swing the pendulum back.
Zach, when you watch a game, do you care how much offense there is? Do you like seeing some of that more physical defense? Like, if you're just like, hey, it's the playoffs, I'm going to tune in, I haven't been watching the NBA that closely. Stylistically, does it matter to you?
Yeah, and maybe I'm not the perfect person to ask, because I think basketball is inherently a physical game. You're 5v5. You're bodying people the whole time. I don't like it when it's just run down the floor and shoot. I think basketball, I mean, in spite of, having a 3-point line and stuff, I think basketball is meant to have physicality to it. Historically, basketball players were called cagers. They got into fights on the floor and stuff. I think it's a necessary part of the game. So I don't like when rules are instituted to make defending hard, automatic foul, technical, whatever it might be. It's a necessary part of the game that I prefer to watch.
Yeah, I think your career on the pickup courts in Traverse City would suggest that you were a fan of physical play. I don't know, Pat, care to weigh in on that?
Yeah, Zach was at CMU when I was a freshman in college. I went to visit him at Central, and we went to what's it called, the rack, the sack? I don't know.
I think it was the rack or the sack, one of the two.
And we were playing pickup basketball, and Zach was like bodying people so much that they wanted to fight all of us, and Zach was not bad. Zach was Ron Holland game, basically trying to get us into a brawl. And I'm like, bro, I'm just here to like drink some beers and like we could play a little pickup basketball, have some fun.
Yeah,
Zach was taking fights.
Tell you what, we won those games. That guy was off his game because he couldn't handle it, and I was half his size. So like, come on.
Yeah, well, everybody's got their style, and you just got to embrace it. I mean, to get back to your point, Pat. I mean, like it's dangerous to do a lot on small sample sizes, right? But it does feel like the NBA is more physical this year than it was last year, and is more physical last year even than it was 2 years ago. There was such an epidemic of players' offensive strategy being just like drawing fouls, not even really in the like shooting motion, to use whatever the official like referee term is, but guys just going in, pausing to draw contact and getting to the line. And the league made an effort to deal with some of that by letting players play a little more physically, I think, last season. And you can see it a little bit. And while we were talking, I kind of looked it up. So, I mean, the best team in the league, you already talked about the Timberwolves and how physical they are. But the Thunder are by far, maybe not by far, Cleveland would probably have something to say about that, but they're the best team in the league, and they're doing it with a defense that is quite a bit better than the best defenses of last year or the season before that. Their defensive rating is like 105.9. I think the Celtics last year led the league and they were around 110, which, that's a pretty significant drop. Now, again, you're talking about the actual best team in the league that is just loaded with athleticism, but they play really physically. And I think aside from the rule changes, I mean, I think when you think about how teams try to win, they're always trying to look for edges. And I think smart teams looked around the league and said, okay, everybody's really valuing shooting the same way. How can we maybe go the other way and say, what if we have guys that can just really defend and can really get after people on the perimeter to try to bring that 3-point percentage down a little bit. And I mean, that is how the Timberwolves advanced last year in the finals. I mean, or in the playoffs. I mean, Jokic in that series was typical Jokic. He was great, but they just obliterated Jamal Murray and the Nuggets guards. And, you could see them being really frustrated that the Pistons were sort of taking a page out of that playbook. So, yeah, I think I'd be excited to see the league get back. I guess I don't necessarily need to see 2 games in the playoffs, but a little more emphasis on defense, I think, would add some possessions. But we're kind of far afield. So let's try to get back a little bit to that particular Pacers team. But I think maybe it will kind of continue this conversation to some degree, because I wanted to talk a little bit about, we touched on it in the playoffs, but I think it's interesting. And my question for you guys is, so both the Pacers of that era and the Pistons, in my opinion, were built sort of similarly, right? They obviously had great players. They had all-stars, but they didn't have a Kobe or a Tim Duncan or a Shaq or an Allen Iverson. They didn't have that guy who was like the face of the league, the quote-unquote superstar. They had 4, 5, 6 really good, really versatile, and really emphasized being able to defend as their path to victory. And honestly, we haven't seen a lot of those teams since then. Do you think that that's a reflection of, those rule changes have just made it so hard for teams that don't have a hyper-efficient offensive player to build their team around to compete? Or do you think that the pendulum will swing back and we'll sort of see these more like balanced teams? I mean, I just thought the similarities in terms of how the teams were constructed really struck out to me.
Yeah, it's hard for me to know exactly, but I'm sure there's some like salary cap implications on how those team constructions work. So like you go from an era where like it's really easy to afford to fill out a roster beyond 2 superstars. The Warriors had Steph Curry and Kevin Durant and Draymond, Klay Thompson making a bunch of money, Iguodala. They still were able to afford all these guys. And now you can't really, because they've allowed the superstar pay scale to get so high that I think what you said, like teams zigging when others zag, I think one of the things was, okay, the efficiency a second superstar gives us on offense, is that worth than the drop-off we have on our next 3 roster spots, because we can't afford guys who are really good two-way players or efficient enough on offense, but, dogs on defense. So I think some of that's probably due to just how salary cap rules have changed over time. And the, CBA collective bargaining agreements over time have changed. I do think the current Celtics are a similar build to both these Pacers and Pistons, where they have a star in Jason Tatum, but he's not a tier 1 superstar, in my opinion. I think he's just below that. He is an all-NBA guy who's not a serious threat to win the MVP award. And I think that's like Jermaine O'Neal, I think, was 3rd in MVP voting in 2003, 2004. But I never remember him being a serious threat to win the MVP over Shaq. It was like he was a step below. And that's where I feel like Boston is. They have Tatum, who's right there, but he's probably the 4th best player in the league, which is awesome. but that also they've been able to build out their team with, 5 guys who can get after you and then play high level on offense too.
Yeah, I mean, Boston's going to have those same sort of contract issues, salary issues. But when you think about NBA now and the, 04, 05 Pacers, it is the roster construct, right? Even just looking at Oklahoma City, their best players are young players. They're all really good. Their sixth man is great. People who they are bringing off the bench are all good, and that's really where you have these windows. And speaking of that team from Boston, they have extended their window, but that's going to close eventually. And these younger teams will be able to fill that. And those Pacers should have filled it at that time, but they had a melee that really just blew it up. Truly, it blew the whole franchise up.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that a little bit more, just about Ron Artest specifically and the type of player he was. So Defensive Player of the Year in 2004, and was known for being towing the line, maybe having some issues before the malice at the Palace. He had famously, I think 2 seasons before, been thrown out of a game in Madison Square Garden, and he yanked the monitor off the scorer's table and launched it onto the court and was suspended. And then the following season, so this 2003-2004 season, when the Pacers were the best team in the East in the regular season, he was suspended for, I think, like several games, maybe a couple weeks, for getting into a fight with Pat Riley. I can't imagine a coach and a player getting into a fight right now, like a physical fight where he like threw an elbow at him and stuff. And Pat Riley, in my mind now, is old and frail, so I kind of feel bad for him having to fight Ron Artest. But Zach was saying when we were playing pickup basketball, he was bragging on his effectiveness in winning the game by getting in someone's head, being physical, not backing down. So there is a relationship between playing that style and being considered a great defender. You have Ron Artest. Famously, right now, you have Draymond Green, who's won several Defensive Player of the Year awards, I think, or is always in the discussion, has anchored a championship defense, and also is always towing the line, sometimes with his literal toes in people's nuts. He has some issues and plays right up to the edge, has clearly won them several titles, but you could argue got suspended and cost them one title in the finals against Cleveland. We think back on other great defensive players. Ben Wallace was not known for like fighting, but also everyone was afraid of him. So he was an intimidator. He was physical, and he was going to scowl at you. And like, I don't think he talked a lot, but like he would shake his head and you were afraid of him. So
well, and
I think there's an intimidation factor.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, that 04 team also had Sheed, right, who was also a volatile personality, to say the least, over his career. I mean, I don't know. I think obviously you don't want guys that are going that far, but I think you do have to at least 1 or 2 guys that like really have that edge, both to like help hold your own team accountable and to go toe to toe. I mean, the Celtics right now have Drew Holiday, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence that they were in contention for several years and added him, and that's the year that they got over the hump. Now, I mean, I don't want to discount the improvements that Tatum have made, that Jaylen Brown has made. Obviously, they added Porzingis, but Drew definitely brings that will get in your face and make life extremely difficult on the other team. And if you go through title teams, it'd be really hard to find, I think, an NBA champion that didn't have a couple of those guys that were willing to kind of push the envelope there.
Yeah, just like thinking about some guys of recent vintage, like Patrick Beverley's entire career is just being annoying, right? Like, isn't it that his whole point is to try to get under your skin and drive people crazy? Dennis Rodman was kind of isn't he known for like blowing in people's ears, like making guys feel uncomfortable, and he was an agitation king. So I think Gobert has won a bunch of Defensive Player of the Years. He's a weird dude who's got his weird stuff. Like, there's just something about, if you're going to be a great defensive player and focus on defense, usually you are trying to get under the skin of the opposition and really annoy them and be physical. And those things, they heighten tension.
Yeah, talking about agitators, we've got a couple of those guys on the current iteration of the Pistons, Pat. I mean, do you feel like that's part of their success this year?
Yeah, it certainly is part of their success. They have an identity, and their identity is that they were the worst team in the NBA last year, and then they came out this year and wouldn't back down to anybody. And that's on a possession by possession, game by game basis, where they're going to battle you. And teams in the NBA, there's like a hierarchy, and you could tell teams get annoyed with teams that kind of get out over their skis. And everyone's annoyed with the Pistons this year, and I think that's an awesome thing. Like, Ron Holland's a 19-year-old rookie, and guys try to bark at him, and he turns around and gets in their face. He doesn't care, and I think there's a toughness level that you need if you want to be a successful team, especially if you're a young team, especially if you don't have a heralded superstar who's going to get every call or can be just, so dominant that they can carry you. So hopefully Cade gets there to be that point. He doesn't get a good whistle yet, but I think that if you talk about the Pistons' identity, it's Cade as their star, and then it's Isaiah Stewart and the defense as kind of their. And there's some Malik Beasley too. I think they missed that. They were missing that swagger and confidence. So if you think back to these Pacers, it wasn't just the physicality and the toughness. They had Reggie Miller and Artest had a ton of confidence that I think good teams need.
A great transition back to talk a little bit more about that team, because I do think we should spend a little time. We talked about Artest. I think we should talk about some of the other guys on that team, and maybe start with Reggie Miller, who career-wise he's maybe the best pacer of all time, but he certainly, from a career accomplishment standpoint, was the most accomplished player on this particular Pacers team. But it's funny because he wasn't, I think he was a fine defender at various points of his career. He wasn't necessarily known for that, but he was known 100% as an agitator, right? And like, he would get under people's skin in different ways than trying to be ultra physical. Although I feel like there were stories about him being sort of a legendary behind the scenes. Like, he'll give you an elbow in the ribs as you're trying to make a cut, like things like that. A player that I think would have been really interesting in today's game because of his outside shooting. Like, maybe one of the first, like, volume by those days standards, but one of those first players where it felt like their offense in some ways was actually designed to get him 3-point shots at various times in his career, which was not the case, as we talked about on the Pistons pod. For a long time, that was just not how NBA offenses work, but he was such a good shooter. And that's what I really remember about him, is like one of those guys where he felt like he could swing a game just with his shooting. Like, you had so many other guys where they were winning by getting in the paint, and he was just like a perimeter oriented player, but that could still sort of like dominate a game if he got hot.
Reggie Miller, obviously 04-05 was his last season in the NBA. He won the sportsmanship award that year, despite, trying to, running around the Knicks court his entire career, choking himself at various celebrities sitting courtside. He scored 39 points in his final game. That was against the Pistons in a playoff loss, of course. That Pacers roster, of course, had then Steven Jackson, who was effectively their best perimeter player because he was able to play, a few games more than Ron Artest did. He was in the 40s, I believe. So yeah, I think this team could have been so much more. It's really disappointing, and if you're a Pacers fan, it's got to be so sad. There's truly nothing memorable about this era of Pacers basketball outside of the Artest melee against the Pistons, and that's unfortunate when you had such talent for several years.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just to kind of recap, so Reggie Miller in the Hall of Fame, 5-time All-Star. Honestly, I would have guessed more than 5 All-Star games if you had just asked me to pick a number. 3-time All-NBA, a career 39.5% 3-point shooter, and again, was taking a ton of threes back then. But I remember him more, he was more of a complimentary piece on this particular team, but he had those big moments in those Knicks series. He famously scored 9 points in 17 seconds. And then, they also had some battles with the Bulls when they had Reggie Miller, Jalen Rose, Rick Smits. I want to say that some of those Bulls series went 6 or 7 games, and I do remember watching those and feeling like, like they were trying to go toe-to-toe, but what can you do when you're playing against Michael Jordan in the 90s? So a tough break for him that he's on a couple of teams that, if he wasn't playing against Michael Jordan, were maybe good enough to win titles. And as we talked about early on in this pod was, maybe on a team good enough to win a title if things had gone differently in 2004, if they hadn't had the melee in 2005. The other really great player on that team that we talked about was Jermaine O'Neal. He, again, that particular season, he finished third in MVP voting. He's got a really interesting career. He spent 4 seasons essentially barely playing. And I think it's pretty unusual for players to get that long of a leash. I think he came straight out of high school. So he was 18 when he gets drafted. And give Portland credit for being really patient with him. Although then they keep him on the team for 4 years and then they trade him. And then in 2 years, he's just like tearing it up for Indiana. But I do think, now if things don't work out in 2 or 3 years, it's rare to see them kind of explode later on. Pat, aside from him allegedly winning you a fantasy basketball championship, what else sticks out to you about Jermaine O'Neal? Like, I just remember him as a really good, if not elite offensive player, a really good defensive player. So really that hybrid of like, he was really good on both ends of the court.
Yeah, he was a really good two-way guy. And he did just, like you said, it was like, every year the hype was like, oh, it's Jermaine O'Neal. He's going to be good once they start giving him playing time. And then they never gave him playing time in Portland. He would do okay. At first, he looked in over his head. Then he started showing some slight signs. And then as his role increased, his productivity increased. And he just kind of exploded into being a monster this 2003-2004 season. I do want to go back to Reggie for a minute and just say one thing that's interesting about Reggie, he is a winner. Even though he never won an NBA title, he played 18 seasons for the Pacers. They missed the playoffs his first 2 seasons, and then 15 out of the next 16 seasons, they made the playoffs. So they were always at least a playoff team, top half of the NBA in the mix, which I think is a pretty crazy longevity. How much of those was him carrying the team? You think about him, and you could make an analogy to some of the guys who are really good and maybe raise the floor of their team, but guys that can't carry you themselves as a star to a championship, then it is really about team building. So you can fall into this position where you're kind of stuck. Like, how do you get your second, third, and fourth guys when every year you're in the playoffs and drafting in the back half of the draft? So we kind of talk about teams and current teams that get stuck in that, oh, well, we drafted this really awesome player. He's homegrown, maybe a Damian Lillard in Portland.
Yeah.
Kind of a career like that where they had some playoff success. Clearly, he wasn't going to be able to lead them to a title. And he also prevented them from ever having high draft picks for them to build a title team around him.
Yeah, the Lillard comparison is a good one. Hadn't thought of that, but yeah, I mean, and in defense of him too, and this is true of any sport, it's also a tough break to spend your entire career in the Eastern Conference against Michael Jordan for most of it, right? So,
yeah. Well, there's that, and there's also I think we should give him respect for staying with the Pacers his whole career. Yeah. He could have the legacy of Ray Allen, who, chased titles, went to Boston and then to Miami. Like, he could have done something like that and chased a title and had a different finish to his career.
Ray Allen had twice the All-Star games as Reggie Miller, so I think that's worth mentioning. Reggie Miller was a 5-time All-Star. It's great he played it on the Pacers his entire career. 5-time All-Star, 3-time All-NBA. Somehow made the NBA's 75th anniversary team. Speaking of his great shooting, Ray Allen, better 3-point career-wise shooter. Glenn Rice also has a better career 3-point shooting. Peja Stojakovic, also higher. Allen Houston, better career three-point shooting than Reggie Miller. Your boy Duncan Robinson as well does have better career three-point shooting. Reggie was a very good player. I think his accolades speak. He was a 5-time All-Star and he played for 17 years.
Yeah, I don't really know. I don't have a response for that. I think.
Well,
Zach,
I think it's a good
making his feelings known about Reggie Miller.
I think it's actually a good segue because I can feel the loathing that Zach has for Reggie Miller and does not think he's deserving of a lot of his accolades. So is there, as a Pistons fan, is there a team, an iteration of any team that you can go back to say you disliked more than this version of the Pacers with Ron Artest, Reggie Miller, Jermaine O'Neal, Steven Jackson, and the Malice at the Palace?
It has to be the Nets. It despised that era Nets.
Really?
Jason Kidd did not care for him.
You weren't a Richard Jefferson fan?
Oh my God, Richard Jefferson can kick rocks all day long. There was probably no player I hated in the NBA in that era more than Richard Jefferson. I despised him.
What about Kenyon Martin?
Yeah, same thing. There was nothing that the Nets for me were the Pistons' rival. It wasn't the Pacers ever. It was the Nets.
So, I mean, I remember the Pistons having battles with that team. Zach, I thought you were going to say the Celtics just because of your long-standing animosity for
Boston.
anything Boston. But I would not have guessed that you would have said Nets. I think it's probably this Pacers team for me. I think if you asked, it'd be interesting to ask different generations of Pistons fans, because obviously there was this huge rivalry with the Bulls in the 80s and 90s, but
and the Celtics to get over the hump for the 89-90 team.
Yeah. But that sort of predates our like real active memories. I mean, I know that like growing up as a Pistons fan, Michael Jordan might have been the most popular player in the league everywhere else, but he was not the most popular player in the league in Michigan, right? It was like people by the end of his career, we had begrudging acceptance of his greatness, but people were not necessarily fans of him. But I don't really remember that. And the Bulls, when he left, went into the mostly abyss that they've been in ever since. So I don't really feel like the Bulls are a major rival. It's probably the Pacers for me. The Going to Work Pistons had such a long run that at various times they did have some great rivalries for a couple years with the Celtics later on. Obviously LeBron kind of ended that run for the Pistons a couple different times, and then the Nets early. I don't know, Pat, what do you think? Like, you asked the question, but who is it for you?
For me, it's this Pacers team. They have, in Detroit sports, their A villain is Claude Lemieux. Nobody comes close to him, but 2 is Ron Artest. He is the next highest guy that I could name that I hated. At this time,
the NFL referees anytime we play Dallas, but...
Yeah, I mean, the NFL, like all the Brett Favre and all the Packers quarterbacks are loathsome too. A single player that was just... Luckily, we didn't lose to them. Otherwise, we would hate them even more if we had lost to this Pacers team. I do think that the Celtics are just, I hate them. Every iteration and version of them are annoying. I do remember specifically feeling that way about the Lakers, but somehow they've been recouped in my mind in the last decade. Like, I don't hate them. They're just, everyone talks about them and that's kind of annoying, but they're at least glitz and fun, whereas the Celtics are just, everything about them sucks. I mean, Shaq, Kobe Lakers, everybody disliked.
You did your stint in Ventura, and you got at least converted to, if not a Lakers fan, a Lakers appreciator, right?
Yeah, I guess maybe that was part of it. And the Pistons weren't competitive, weren't battling them anymore, so it wasn't like I felt a rivalry or like it was a team taking something away. Weirdly, the Cavs don't make no iteration of Cleveland. You would think that, I mean, LeBron basically ended the going to work era Pistons. You would think I would have hated them more, but I didn't. I disliked LeBron in Miami more than I ever did with him on the Cavs. Like, both times on the Cavs, I was fine with him. I know a lot of people dislike the Warriors just in general as a super team. I never felt that. Low-key, currently, there's a little rivalry between the Pistons and the Houston Rockets based on the Jalen Green, Cade Cunningham draft, the Thompson twin brothers, and both as like kind of rebuild teams that are coming out of the rebuild at the same time. So they kind of, I think, look at each other as a like litmus test of where you're at. But it's interesting. I think this Pacers team tops it for me. Luckily, we had the Tayshaun Prince block and we beat them. Before this pod, I said this was kind of a cheating way that we were going to backdoor talk about the Pistons championships a lot, of which we've done a bit. But this Pacers team, I think, stands on their own merit as a loathsome, hateable team.
Yeah, I want to just jump in real quick, Kenny. And Pat, you're right. Artest by far is it's Lemieux, and then Artest is number 2. Metta World Artest, I think, is what he's going by now.
I wanted to ask you guys that. Is it? Sorry for interrupting you, Zach. Should we like this whole pod? Should we have been calling him by his current name? Is that like
probably,
wrong?
But I.
That's what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do?
I mean.
Yeah, the rest of his career when he was on the Lakers, when he was an old man and like talking about how he's reformed himself, it was like, no, this guy's junk.
I had a disdain for Steven Jackson his entire career, and I couldn't even really remember his role in the Malice. I just would like look at him and be like, well, I dislike that guy. What's with that?
So a couple of points to close it out. So the Basketball Reference page lists him as Metta World Peace still. So I don't know, maybe that's his official thing. I mean, I guess if you hear this, you're welcome to come on the pod. We're sorry for not getting your name right. It's hard. We spent our entire mid-20s thinking of you as one thing. We can't get that out of our heads. But it's so on his Basketball Reference it says Metta World Peace, and then it says formerly known as Ronald William Artest, changed to Metta World Peace 2011, then to, and I quote, the Panda's Friend 2014, and Metta Sanford Artest 2020. So he'll have to forgive us if, we are struggling to figure out what to go with and have been sticking with Ron Artest through this pod. But, a couple things. We talked about, like, if the Pistons don't make the trade for Rasheed Wallace, I don't think they're good enough to beat the Pacers team without Sheed. So I think, and we talked about, we think the Pacers were good enough to beat the Lakers in the finals. So they could potentially win the title that year. I don't know. It's one regular season game. So I know if you read through that oral history, the Pacers feel like they were going to win the title. Of course they did, right? In 2005, the year of the melee. I don't know that you can go that far based off of one result, but man, they did beat the Pistons' ass in that game. It was like a 15-point win that was not that close. So I do think, and then, the team like pretty quickly falls apart. They amazingly will just kind of close out what happened to them. But Ron Artest, he comes back the season after the suspension. Things are never the same. They end up trading him to Sacramento for the previously mentioned Peja Stojakovic. And the team, their identity is sort of gone. Jermaine O'Neal battles injuries, and they are not really like in contention for another decade. So, it's interesting to think about a lot of what ifs for this team that could have resulted in a title. We might think about Reggie Miller differently. We might think about the league differently if some of those things had happened.
Yeah, I'm sure the Pacers fans play that what if, like you said, they thought they were going to win the year of the Malice. If we reverse it, are the Pistons the most hated team for the Pacers? I would think so, right? Like we prevented this amazing version of their team that won over 60 games from making the NBA Finals, and then provoked their superstar into getting suspended for the rest of the season and the playoffs. So if we reverse it, it's probably even way worse for a Pacers fan to think about the Pistons.
Yeah, I would imagine that because of how good the Going to Work Pistons were, they ended a lot of teams' playoff runs, So yeah. I imagine that there were a lot of people, and they played a style that was also, as we talked about, pretty antagonistic and pretty frustrating to watch. So I imagine that iteration would rank pretty high. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and they're Isaiah Thomas being their coach for a number of years and not producing the greatest success. I'm sure that's just like they just don't care for the Pistons at all.
Yeah, we're kind of just rambling here at the end, but the coaching thing is, so it's interesting that Isaiah, the Pistons great, was the Pacers coach, and then they fire him and hire the Rick Carlisle, who had been that iteration of the Pistons coach before they let him go. And he was really successful with those Pistons. It was just, they just felt like they needed something different to kind of take that next step. So yeah, I imagine that probably the years of playing against each other and the familiarity between them probably bred some of that rivalry, both in the playoffs and in the event.
Yeah. So, and we might get a rekindling of the rivalry this year. 20 years later, we've got the Pacers in 4th place in the Eastern Conference and the Pistons in 5th. And 2 young superstar point guards who kind of, if you would have asked people a year ago, everyone would have ranked Tyrese Halliburton over Cade Cunningham. Halliburton's known for his antics and talking a lot of talk. Ben Mathurin hates the Pistons because they drafted Jaden Ivey over him when he felt slighted. They have, this current Pistons team we talked about that's super physical. So we could have some fireworks here in just coming up the next month.
Yeah, for sure. If that playoff series, and I know this podcast is supposed to be devoted to history, but if Ron Holland punches Tyrese Halliburton, we will do an emergency podcast so that we can get Pat's takes about whatever led to that. I mean, I don't know if Holland or Stu would be the most he deserved it preemptively. We'll just record it now. It's like Zach on the playground. I don't know, whatever those guys were doing, they probably deserved for Zach talk trash to him. Although the way Pat tells it, Zach may have been the more of the antagonist in that than the respondent.
A bit of an instigator.
All right. Well, this was fun again. Anything else we need to cover on the Pacers? We'll have to continue finding ways to talk about our favorite teams. We've done that in both of the last 2 with the Vikings and this Pacers team, but a lot of fun ones and a lot of fun ones still on the board. So yeah, this has been fun. I'll talk to you all later. We'll figure out when we're going to do this again.
Thanks, Kenny.
Yep. Later.
See you guys.